They called me such a lucky woman, while he was texting another woman that he wished it was her he was celebrating 51 years with, not me. I remember that line more clearly than I remember my own wedding vows. It was glowing on his screen at 11:37 p.m., the night before our anniversary. Blue bubble, neat punctuation, no hesitation, no shame. His name on top. Her name shortened to something flirty and stupid, like you'd give a puppy or a dessert. I wasn't snooping. People always assume that old women turn into detectives with age, but I wasn't hunting for anything. I was just clearing the coffee table, picking up his phone from the cushion where he'd left it face down. Because the grandchildren were coming early in the morning, and he's careless with his things, and when I lifted it, the screen woke up, and the message was just there, exposed, as if it wanted to be seen. I wish it were you here instead of her. Tomorrow would mean something then. Tomorrow. Our golden 51 years, the miracle marriage, as our friends like to call it, the altar of endurance they all pretended to worship at, the story people told about us in church patios and retirement luncheons, about the boy who came back from Vietnam and married the girl who waited, and how we made it through layoffs, miscarriages, the death of our first son, my cancer scare, his bypass, the slow decay of our parents, and all the small, blunt cruelties of ordinary life. And now here, he was sitting upstairs in our bedroom in his thinning t-shirt, already asleep with his mouth slightly open, while his phone confessed for him in that cold, stupid font. I'm 74 years old. My name is Ellen. My hands shake if I hold a cup too long in my left one. My right hip complains when it rains. I fall asleep by 10 most nights with a library book on my chest. And I have spent more than half a century believing that if something breaks, you fix it. If someone strays, you pull them back with patience and love. If trust wobbles, you stand still until it finds its balance again. But that night, standing in the soft yellow pool of light from the lamp in our quiet living room, looking at those words, at the history scrolled above them, at hotel confirmations, little heart emojis, the picture she'd sent of her legs in some cheap motel mirror, at his words saying, "I feel alive with you," and she doesn't understand me anymore. And I hate feeling old next to her. The part of me that had memorized every rule of endurance went very quiet, and something else, something colder and cleaner, stepped forward and took my place. I didn't cry. I noticed that first, like a scientist taking notes. No sudden sting in the nose, no hot rush behind the eyes, just a kind of vast internal exhale, like someone had opened a window in a sealed room I didn't know I was suffocating in. I scrolled. I read enough to know this wasn't a fling born yesterday, not some pathetic last grasp at virility after a glass of whiskey. This had roots. It reached back to the year after my hip surgery, when I was groggy and slower, and he'd joke with our friends that he had to drag me through the supermarket now, jokes that had stung, but I'd laughed along with because that's what you do when you've built a life on not making scenes, when, at 68, you tell yourself men say stupid things. But he's here. He stayed. That must count for something. It turns out he'd stayed with his body and his toothbrush and his pension. But the part of him that spoke in complete sentences had moved somewhere else. I put the phone back exactly as I'd found it, face down on the cushion, a little to the left so it wouldn't look disturbed. An old habit from raising children and knowing what they notice when they lie. Then I went into the kitchen and filled the kettle and stood there, watching the water think about boiling. They say discovery is a moment, but this one stretched. Every bubble in the kettle seemed to match a phrase I'd just read. You're my real home. She'll never know. Tomorrow I'll be thinking of you. I took the kettle off before it screamed, because my nerves couldn't bear the whistle, and poured the hot water over one of my mint tea bags. The cheap kind, he always said, tasted like lawn clippings. And I smiled because apparently I'd been drinking grass for decades to save money, while he used his phone like a teenager in a motel. The clock on the wall said 11:42. The banner for the party tomorrow was already taped in its box on the dining room table. Happy 51st, Ellen and Jack. The bakery receipt was pinned to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a sunflower our granddaughter made in kindergarten. The cake they would deliver was white with gold trim. Because you're our inspiration, in looping script, ordered by our daughter, who still believed in us the way I once did. There were vases ready for flowers, my good plates stacked on the sideboard, champagne flutes polished that afternoon by my own hands until they sang under the cloth. Half the church was coming, the neighbors from 3 houses down, our son flying in with his boys, everyone eager to bask in the glow of what they thought was proof that love can last, if you just stay gentle and stubborn long enough. I walked through the dining room, touched the back of each chair lightly like I was counting them, and thought, they're coming to celebrate a lie, and I have less than 24 hours to decide whether I will let them. There's a peculiar humiliation that only long-married women know, the kind you don't see in movies, where it's all rage and wine and broken glasses. Ours is quieter. It's arithmetic. The years added up, the meals cooked, the appointments kept, the funerals attended hand in hand, the emergencies absorbed, the insults passed over, the compromises made, and then one short message on a bright screen subtracts your name from the story of your own life with a single casual pronoun. Her. That night, I took my tea into the small room we call my sewing room, though I haven't sewn in a year, and sat in the old armchair by the window, the one that has our history pressed into its cushions, and I let the house speak to me. I have always believed the objects remember. The hallway mirror that saw me leave for work in my 30s. Hair still dark and lipstick too bright. The kitchen table that endured homework, arguments, bills, Christmas. The bed that held both our exhausted bodies through flu seasons and family crises. All of them had borne witness to my loyalty, and now all of them were accessories to his betrayal. It should have broken me. It didn't. Instead, something in me aligned. I'm not young. I don't have decades to waste on healing arcs and slow negotiations. At 74, every season counts differently. Every humiliation feels like theft. I sat there and thought, very calmly, tomorrow, they will raise their glasses to a dead thing. He doesn't know I know. She doesn't know I exist except as an obstacle in his narrative. Our children don't know they are bringing their children into a room built on rot. I thought of calling my daughter. I imagined her face crumpling, her saying, "Mom, are you sure? Maybe it's a misunderstanding." The way daughters always want the story to stay simple, because if our love is fragile, theirs feels less safe. I thought of waking him up and just handing him the phone, watching him stammer and reach for lies. But the idea bored me, like watching a rerun of a bad show. I took another sip of my tea. It had cooled, a thin film on top, and I realized my hand was steady. I am Ellen, 74, retired English teacher, mother of 2, grandmother of 4, owner of 1 decent cardigan collection, and a spine I trusted less than I should have until that moment. I have arranged my entire adult life around the principle that you do not humiliate the people you love. That night, I understood with a strange, aching clarity that he did not love me in any way I recognized anymore. Because when love goes stale, it doesn't always leave. Sometimes it stays and festers and writes new messages to someone else in hotel rooms off the interstate. And if there is no love left to protect, then there is nothing left I am obliged to hide. I finished the tea, rinsed the cup, turned off the lights, and stood at the foot of the stairs, listening to his snore drifting down, a sound that had once comforted me, proof that he'd made it through another day, that his heart was still beating. Beside mine, now it sounded like someone else's husband sleeping in my house. I went up, each step slow but deliberate, the old wood creaking in soft protest. And when I opened our bedroom door, I looked at him for a long time in the dimness. The man I'd met at 19, with his cocky grin and trembling hands. The man I'd chosen again and again through every hardship. The man half the town would swear adored me. I could have shaken him awake. Instead, I walked past, into the bathroom, closed the door, and looked at myself in the mirror. Not the caricature of an old woman, not the lucky wife, just a woman whose marriage had just been pronounced dead by glowing text. I smoothed my hair, leaned closer, and said quietly, "We are not going to beg." In the morning, there would be guests and flowers and speeches, and my husband would think he got away with it. That's what he fell asleep believing. That's what made me decide to give him exactly the celebration he deserved. He woke before me, humming under his breath. The same tuneless half-song he always made when he shaved, that silly optimism that used to make me smile and now only felt like noise from another life. The morning light came in pale and slow through the curtains, painting stripes across the bedspread that smelled faintly of the lavender detergent I'd always used, the scent of order, of domestic peace. He looked at me over his shoulder and said, "Morning, sweetheart, big day," as if nothing had been rewritten in the dark between us, as if the night hadn't turned our life inside out. I answered with the same automatic warmth that long marriages teach you. Habit, not love. I said, "Yes, big day," and smiled in the mirror while brushing my hair. I have learned over the years that silence can protect you better than honesty when the person across from you has stopped seeing who you are. He asked where the good cufflinks were, and I told him. Same drawer as always. He kissed the top of my head without looking, like someone paying a small tax, and went downstairs to make coffee. I stood in the bedroom alone, surrounded by the clothes I'd laid out for celebration. The gold scarf our daughter bought me. The soft cream dress that had survived 30 years of careful storage. They looked like relics from a life that didn't belong to me anymore. The text messages had not vanished with sleep. They had colonized the air. I could still see the words as clearly as the sunlight on the wall, could still hear her little digital giggle in my head. I had read too many of them to believe it was an accident. There were dates, times, receipts, the language of logistics and lust woven together in a pattern that only the foolish or the careless could ignore. He had used the same tenderness I once thought was reserved for me, and that was the deeper wound. Not the betrayal of flesh, but of language. He had stolen my sentences. "You make me feel at home. You calm my nerves. You still surprise me." He had built a small house of borrowed phrases and invited another woman to live inside it. That was the theft. I made the bed slowly, smoothing the sheets, a motion that had always soothed me. Every corner tucked in felt like reclaiming 1 inch of order from the chaos in my chest. Downstairs, I could hear the clink of cups, the radio, his easy whistling. I thought of how often I had defended him to friends when they said he could be distant. I had called it shyness, modesty, old-fashioned reserve. I never wanted to admit that he simply didn't like listening. He liked performing. And last night, in those messages, I had seen his best performance. A man alive with a woman half my age, promising her that he felt seen for the first time in years. How ironic, I thought, that it took my invisibility to make him feel visible. When I came down the stairs, he had already set the breakfast table. 2 plates, toast, fruit, the effort of a man pretending to be devoted. "You didn't have to," I said. "Nonsense, it's our day," he replied, smiling, with the bright falseness of someone selling nostalgia. He poured my coffee. I looked at his hands, steady and sure. The same hands that had held my hair back when I was sick, that had built the fence in our yard, that had trembled the first time he asked me to dance. Those hands had also typed every word that killed us. "You look beautiful, Elle," he said. "You always do." He hadn't looked at me for more than a second. I realized then that I was sitting across from a man rehearsing a script. The part of me that used to ache to fix things just watched, detached, almost curious, like observing an actor forget his lines. When he left to pick up the flowers, I opened his briefcase, something I had never done in half a century together. Inside, neat and predictable, the receipts, the anniversary card he'd signed the night before. "To my forever love." His handwriting, neat as always, his name trailing like an apology he didn't mean. Beneath the card was an envelope from a hotel, folded, empty, but still smelling faintly of cologne. I held it to my face for a moment, not because I wanted to torture myself, but because I needed the confirmation that what I'd seen on that screen wasn't a hallucination born of old age and paranoia. The scent was unmistakable, expensive, one he'd never worn at home. I slipped the envelope back, closed the briefcase, and sat at the kitchen table. There are moments when a person realizes that the map of their life has been redrawn without permission, and this was mine. The world still looked the same. The morning light, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant barking of the neighbor's dog. But it all tilted slightly, like the stage floor had been shifted under me. I was still playing my role, but the play had changed genres. He returned half an hour later with a bouquet so large it looked absurd, roses and lilies and some tropical flower he couldn't name, all perfume and apology wrapped in cellophane. "Got us something special," he said, setting it down like a trophy. I watched the droplets of water slide down the plastic and thought of how easy it was to buy beauty, to hide rot under scent. He asked if I was excited for tonight, if I'd picked out my earrings. I told him yes. He talked about the caterer, the guests, the speech he was planning. "Nothing too emotional," he said. "Just a bit of humor, you know. Keep it light." I nodded. Light. The word stayed in my head. He had lived in light for so long. Light jokes, light responsibilities, light guilt, while I carried the weight of everything that actually held us together. The bills, the appointments, the remembering. He thought love was the sparkle of chandeliers. I knew it was the quiet repair of leaks. Around noon, our daughter called to say she'd booked the photographer and would be at the house by 5. "You two deserve the best," she said, her voice bright with pride. I said thank you, forcing my voice to sound steady. I wanted to tell her to save her money, that the only thing we deserved was distance, but I couldn't ruin her belief yet. Not for nothing. Not until I understood what I was going to do. After lunch, he took a nap in the den. He always did that before big events, said it kept him fresh. I stood in the doorway, watching him sleep, his mouth slightly open, a small line of drool at the corner, his chest rising and falling with mechanical rhythm. I remembered the first time I'd watched him sleep in a tiny apartment where the walls smelled of paint and youth, when his body had been all nerves and hope. I remembered the first night we brought our daughter home, how he'd kept checking if the baby was breathing. I remembered the fights we'd had, the reconciliations, the slow fading of urgency. And I realized that everything I remembered was about care, mine for him, never the other way around. I thought of that woman, Claire. I had learned her name from the messages and wondered if he pretended to be the caretaker with her, if he played the gallant man who lifts luggage, who pays for dinners, who promises tenderness. Maybe he believed his own act. Maybe he thought he was rediscovering youth. What he didn't understand was that infidelity at our age isn't romance. It's vanity with arthritis. I stood there long enough to feel my anger transform into something colder, something that could be used. When he woke, he stretched, smiled at me, and said, "You should rest, too. Big night ahead." I said I would. I went upstairs instead and sat at my desk. I took a blank sheet of paper and wrote the date, May 17th. Then, without planning, I began to list every hotel name I'd seen in his messages, every date that overlapped with his business trips, every lie I had smiled through. The list grew longer than I expected. It wasn't grief I felt. It was recognition, the slow acceptance that this had been happening while I was ironing his shirts, baking his birthday pies, sitting beside him at church. The deceit was layered, habitual, comfortable for him. That comfort enraged me more than the affair itself. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it inside my drawer. Not as evidence, not as a threat, simply to remind myself that I wasn't crazy. He had chosen deceit, and I had chosen to wake up. Downstairs, he was humming again, setting up chairs, practicing smiles. I watched from the staircase, unseen, and thought of how many times I had rescued him from his own clumsiness, his forgetfulness, his public missteps. How many times I had been the quiet editor of his life. Not anymore. The kettle whistled again, sharp, insistent. I poured water into the sink and let the steam rise, clouding the window. The mirror of the glass gave me back a stranger's face, calm, deliberate, still. The woman who had discovered those texts last night was gone. In her place stood someone calculating the next sentence of her life. When he called my name, cheerful, oblivious, asking if I'd seen the new champagne flutes, I answered gently, "They're right in front of you, dear." And in that moment, I understood something vital. He would never see what was in front of him, not. Really? But tonight, he would. The afternoon stretched itself thin, the kind of warm, fragile day where the air feels heavy with waiting. I moved through the house slowly, touching the backs of chairs, adjusting a frame here, smoothing a napkin there, doing what I had always done, making things look perfect for the guests who would come later to celebrate what no longer existed. Jack busied himself in the yard, pretending to arrange the tables, calling out from time to time about where the caterer should park or whether the lights along the hedge were still working. His voice, so familiar, sounded distant now, like a recording from another life. I watched him through the kitchen window, his movements confident, practiced, the swagger of a man admired for his steadiness. There was something obscene about how easily he could perform, how little guilt seemed to bend his shoulders. The messages from last night were still living inside my head, whispering every time I blinked. And yet he walked across the lawn with the ease of someone untouched. I had spent half a century believing we were a single story, and now I understood we had been two entirely different books bound under one cover. By 3 o'clock, the caterers arrived. 2 young women in black shirts and white aprons began unloading trays from the van, the smell of butter and garlic filling the kitchen. They smiled at me, polite, brisk, unaware that they were stepping into the theater of my undoing. I offered them lemonade, asked if they needed extra napkins, my voice even, my hands steady. I have always been good at hospitality. It's the one art every woman of my generation was taught before we knew what else we could be. One of the girls complimented the house and said, "You two must be so happy. 51 years. That's something." I smiled because it was easier than explaining that happiness is a costume people wear until it stops fitting. Jack came in, kissed my cheek for show, his lips barely brushing skin, and told the girls how lucky he was. He used the same tone I'd heard in those messages, the soft, performative sincerity he reserved for people who didn't know him long enough to see the seams. I wanted to laugh, but laughter felt too alive for that moment. Instead, I just nodded, my throat tight with something that wasn't sorrow anymore. It was clarity, hard and luminous like glass. When he left again to pick up the champagne, I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the hum of refrigerators and the rustle of leaves outside, and let the silence settle around me. It had a texture, that silence, the same as the one that filled the years between us after our children moved out, when conversation became functional, polite, safe. For a long time, I had mistaken that silence for peace. Now I understood it had been the slow erasure of my existence. He had been fading me out like a photograph left in sunlight, and I had helped by standing still. I thought of how he had once said, "You make things so easy, Elle," meaning it as praise, and I had taken it as love. I should have known better. Easy women become invisible, and invisible women are convenient to betray. Upstairs, the dress hung on the wardrobe door, its fabric pale and forgiving. I ran my hands along it, felt the smoothness under my fingers, and thought how strange it was that I would still wear it, not out of affection, but as armor. I would let him have his celebration, the illusion he craved, because illusions have a way of devouring their creators. I wanted him to be comfortable right up to the moment the ground opened. My mind, usually so cautious, so concerned with decorum, began to form plans without my permission. There was a printer in the study, an old thing that still worked when coaxed. I opened the drawer where I kept the good paper, the kind we used for invitations and letters. My hands didn't shake as I sat at his desk, the same desk where he balanced our checkbook and booked his so-called business trips. I opened his laptop. He'd left it unlocked, confident in my ignorance. And there they were, the emails, the confirmations, the digital fingerprints of his deceit. I copied the messages from his mistress, the hotel bills, even one photo attachment he'd been foolish enough to save. I printed them one by one, the soft whir of the machine filling the room like a heartbeat. When the printer jammed, I didn't curse. I simply pulled the page free and smoothed it out, calm, methodical. It was the same patience I'd used all my life, but turned inward now, no longer serving him. When I finished, I placed each page in a neat envelope, folded once, sealed with the kind of precision that borders on tenderness. I took the envelopes downstairs and laid them out on the dining table, one at each place setting, beside the gold-rimmed plates and the crystal glasses. There was a cruel symmetry to it, a domestic perfection I almost admired. To anyone walking in, it would look like the final touch of a devoted wife, the small details that make an evening special. I imagined their faces later, the guests opening them, the rustle of paper mixing with the clinking of forks, the silence that would follow. It wasn't revenge I wanted. Revenge is noisy, desperate. I wanted truth, and truth, when delivered quietly, echoes the longest. The house felt different after that. The air itself seemed charged, not with guilt or fear, but with inevitability. I brewed another pot of tea and sat by the window, watching Jack's shadow move across the lawn as he spoke with the neighbor, probably boasting about how his wife still looked so elegant for her age. I wondered what he'd tell them tomorrow when the news spread, whether he'd cry or deny, whether he'd twist the story into something that made him look noble. He'd always been a master at that, but I realized that I didn't care anymore. For the first time in decades, his reaction wasn't my responsibility. Around 5, our daughter arrived with her husband and the grandchildren, bringing a rush of laughter and motion that filled the air with temporary warmth. The little ones ran to hug me, their sticky hands and loud voices a kind of mercy I hadn't expected. I bent to kiss their heads and inhaled the scent of sunscreen and candy. They didn't know they were walking into a battlefield. My daughter fussed over the decorations, asked where her father was, told me how proud she was that we'd made it this far. "You're what marriage should look like," she said, and I almost smiled at the irony. I wanted to tell her the truth then, to spare her from the illusion of permanence, but I couldn't. Not yet. She deserved one more night of believing in love before she learned what it looks like when it breaks quietly. When Jack returned, he was radiant, full of the false humility of a man about to be adored. He carried the champagne with a flourish, set it down, kissed our daughter, made a joke about the grandchildren drinking apple juice in flutes. I watched him, noting how easily he slipped into his favorite character, the devoted patriarch, the charming husband, the moral anchor of every gathering. He had practiced this role for so long that even I had believed it once, but tonight I would let the curtain fall. The guests began to arrive just before sunset, cars lining the street, voices rising in cheerful greetings. I stood by the door with my practiced smile, the one that had carried me through funerals and holidays alike, greeting each familiar face with warmth that felt detached from my body. Compliments came easily. How young we looked, how strong our love must be, how lucky we were. I thanked them all, letting the words slide over me without landing. The house filled with light and music, laughter bouncing off the walls. I moved among them, refilling drinks, adjusting plates, the perfect hostess, invisible as always but indispensable. Jack gave his little speech, predictable as a hymn. He spoke about partnership, patience, the beauty of growing old together. He even quoted a line from one of our favorite songs, a gesture meant to make me blush. I looked at him and felt nothing but the strange stillness of knowing something he didn't. When he lifted his glass to toast to my beautiful Ellen, the best decision I ever made, I lifted mine too, smiled sweetly, and thought, yes, you did, because I'm the only one who still knows what kind of man you really are. After the speech, people clapped, music played again, the buffet opened. Laughter rose, glasses clinked, and for a while, the scene looked exactly as it should. But under the surface, a quiet pulse of dread had begun, and I could feel it in my bones. I excused myself, went upstairs and looked down from the landing at the room below. The bright colors, the movement, the illusion. I remembered our first anniversary, the cheap motel, the stolen flowers from the park, the way he'd said, "We'll always have this honesty between us, Elle." I almost laughed. I stayed there for a long minute, memorizing the site, because I knew by midnight this room would never look the same again. Then I turned and went back down, my face serene, my voice calm, and when he smiled at me across the crowd, I smiled back, because I wanted him to believe right until the last possible second that everything was still under his control. It was almost 6 when the last tray of food was arranged on the long dining table and the candles were lit. Thin gold stems burning with a polite, steady flame that smelled faintly of wax and sugar. The light softened everything, blurred the edges of the evening into something almost merciful, and for a moment I thought about calling it off, letting the night pass like all the others, smiling through the toast and pretending the world was still. What it used to be, but mercy had become another form of cowardice in our house, and I had run out of reasons to protect him from his own reflection. The envelopes were already in place, discreet, elegant, aligned perfectly with the silverware. I stood at the head of the table, checking each one again, making sure the seals hadn't come loose, and I caught sight of my reflection in the glass of the framed family photo that hung above the sideboard. There we were, Jack, myself, the children, the grandchildren, our smiles frozen in a version of history that had never existed. I stared at that picture for a long time, at the way his arm curled around my shoulder, the way I leaned into him as if gravity itself were marital love, and I understood that I had been leaning for 51 years. Tonight, I would stand. He came up behind me, his voice low, cheerful, already buoyed by the praise he expected to receive. "Everything looks beautiful, Elle. You outdid yourself again." He slid his arm around my waist, and I felt the familiar weight of his hand resting just above my hip, the same hand that had written words to another woman only a day ago. I turned to him and smiled, not with affection, but with the precision of an actress aware of her audience. "You deserve the best, Jack," I said, and his eyes warmed with the pleasure of a man believing his own myth. He kissed my cheek, careless, perfunctory, and moved away to greet the first of the guests who were filtering through the open door. I stayed where I was, my heart steady, my breathing calm. There was no fear left, only the sense of inevitability that comes when a storm has already broken, and all that remains is to let the rain fall. The house filled quickly, the low hum of conversation blending with the clinking of glasses and the faint strains of music drifting from the living room stereo. People hugged, laughed, exclaimed about how young we looked, how inspiring it was to see love endure. Every word landed like a stone on my skin, but I smiled, accepted compliments, poured drinks, guided coats to hooks. It struck me that I had spent my entire adulthood perfecting the art of invisibility under the guise of hospitality. A woman who keeps the plates full and the wine flowing is never really seen. She becomes an extension of the furniture, useful, reliable, unremarkable. That was the role I had played so well that even now, on the eve of my rebellion, no one noticed the shift in my eyes. At one point, our neighbor Margaret clasped my hand, her perfume sweet and cloying, and said, "You're the luckiest woman I know, Ellen. After all these years, he still looks at you like you're the only one in the room." I wanted to tell her he looked at everyone that way. Every woman, every reflection of himself that adored him. But I simply squeezed her hand and said, "He's always been good at keeping an audience." She laughed, not catching the edge in my tone, and drifted away toward the buffet table where he stood holding court, laughing too loudly, telling the story about our first vacation as if it were a legend. I watched him, the way his shoulders squared, the practiced charm, the easy gestures that had once seduced me into forgiving everything. It was strange, almost scientific. Observing him like a specimen preserved in glass, I realized that I no longer loved him, not even in the wounded, nostalgic way one might love an old photograph. What I felt was distance, clear and cool as glass between us. In the kitchen, I took a moment to breathe. The caterers were finishing up, the dishes gleaming under the bright light, the smell of roast and citrus thick in the air. I opened the back door for a moment to let the cool evening air in, and the sound of the garden drifted to me, the chirping of crickets, the faint rustle of the trees. It struck me how alive everything was outside this carefully curated celebration of decay. I thought about running, about simply walking out the door and never coming back, taking nothing but the clothes on my back and my own pulse. But then I thought of the children, the grandchildren, of the legacy they thought they were inheriting, and I knew that silence would be the crueler betrayal. Lies don't die quietly. They reproduce in the dark. I couldn't let them grow up thinking this was what endurance meant. I returned to the dining room as the guests began to take their seats. The hum of conversation dimmed into the gentle clatter of cutlery, the rustle of napkins unfolding, the low shuffle of anticipation. Jack moved to his chair at the opposite end of the table, his smile wide and confident. He tapped his glass with a fork. "Before we begin," he said, "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight. 51 years. It's not something you achieve alone. Ellen's been my rock, my compass, the reason I get up every morning." His voice softened, perfectly pitched for sympathy. "She's shown me what real love looks like." The applause that followed felt like static against my skin. He looked at me, that practiced gaze, tender enough to fool even the closest observer, and I held his eyes until he faltered. It was subtle, a flicker, a tiny break in his rhythm. But I saw it. He sensed something he couldn't name, and it unsettled him. When the applause died down, I stood. "Thank you, Jack," I said, my voice steady, calm, almost gentle. "You've always had a gift for words." The guests smiled, expecting a sweet, sentimental reply. I looked around the table at their faces, all bright and open, and I felt a sudden pang, not of guilt, but of recognition. These people were the witnesses of my entire adult life. The neighbors who'd borrowed sugar, the women from church, the men who'd played golf with him and toasted our anniversaries every decade. They were the chorus that had repeated the same comforting myth about us for so long that I had begun to mistake it for truth. I owed them honesty, if only once. I lifted my glass. "We've gathered to celebrate 51 years of marriage," I said. "That's a long time to share a life with someone, long enough to build and long enough to destroy." A few polite chuckles rippled through the room. They thought I was being dramatic, playful. I smiled faintly. But love, as it turns out, can survive everything except lies. I gestured toward the envelopes. "And tonight, you'll all find a little something to remind you of that." The silence that followed was pure and immediate, the kind that swallows sound before it reaches the walls. I could hear the faint hiss of the candles, the clink of a fork slipping from someone's hand. Jack's smile froze, his face pale, then flushed. He laughed nervously. "Elle, what is this? Some kind of joke?" I tilted my head slightly, the way you might at a child who's asking a question he already knows the answer to. Why don't you open yours and find out? Around the table, chairs shifted. Hands reached for envelopes. The sound of tearing paper filled the room, dry and final. Then came the first gasp, sharp as glass. Another followed, then a low murmur spreading like wind through tall grass. The pictures, the texts, the hotel receipts. They did the speaking for me. I didn't need to say a word. Jack stood up, his chair scraping the floor, his voice cracking. Ellen, for God's sake, what have you done? I looked at him steady. Only what you taught me, Jack. You always said honesty was the foundation of marriage. I thought you'd appreciate the gesture. He reached for me, but I stepped back. I could see it in his eyes then. The panic. The collapsing mask, the small, frightened boy beneath the vanity. It should have satisfied me. But what I felt was something quieter. Release. For years, I had carried the burden of maintaining the illusion, of smoothing over his temper, his carelessness, his boredom. And now, finally, the weight had shifted back to where it belonged. Someone stood up, mumbled an excuse, headed for the door. Another followed. The chatter had turned into whispers, sharp and uncomfortable. My daughter stared at me, her face pale, her mouth open as if words were trying to find their way out, but couldn't. The grandchildren sat wide-eyed, confused, too young to understand, but old enough to sense disaster. I looked at her and shook my head softly, a small reassurance that this chaos had meaning. Then I turned back to him. You wanted a celebration, Jack, I said. Here it is, the truth, in front of everyone who believed in you. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. I lifted my glass again, though the champagne had gone flat. To 51 years, I said quietly. May the next one finally be honest. Then I set the glass down, untouched, and walked away from the table, through the murmurs, through the wreckage of polite society unraveling behind me, and into the night air that felt clean and sharp and mine. The first sound I remember after I stepped out into the night was my own heartbeat, too loud in my ears, not frantic but insistent, like it was knocking from the inside to tell me it was still there, still mine. The yard, draped in fairy lights and decorations we had strung together that morning like obedient actors, now looked like the aftermath of a cheap magic trick exposed under fluorescent bulbs. Voices, confused and rising, floated out from the house behind me, clashing with the gentle chirp of crickets and the muted hum of traffic down the street. I stood on the grass in my cream dress and sensible shoes, feeling the air cool against the bare skin at my collarbone, and I thought, this is the first honest breath I've taken in years. It didn't last long. The sliding door opened hard enough to rattle, and Jack came out after me, his face a strange mix of fury and pleading, the practiced charm stripped away, leaving something raw and unfinished. "What the hell was that, Ellen?" he hissed, his voice low but shaking, because he knew there were still people watching from inside, shapes moving behind glass, pretending not to stare. I looked at him, at the man I had just undressed in front of his own mythology, and felt that same cool clarity settle over me like a shawl. That, I said calmly, was the truth catching up. He dragged a hand through his hair, an old gesture from younger days, the boy in him scrambling for a version of this he could survive. "You humiliated me," he said. "You humiliated yourself. In front of our children, our friends, the church. What were you thinking?" The words hit me with a strange familiarity, because they were the same ones I had used silently on him last night while standing over his lit screen. Only back then I'd aimed them inward, asking what I had been thinking all these years. To keep choosing a man, I had to keep explaining to myself. Now he was trying to hand that shame back like a coat I refused to wear. "No," I said. "I revealed what you hid. You did the humiliating. I just put a frame around it so other people could finally see the picture." He opened his mouth to deny it, to reach for some pathetic lie about the messages being taken out of context or not meaning anything, but he had seen the pages, printed in his own words. "There are some betrayals too explicit to bury in excuses." His jaw flexed. "You could have talked to me," he said. "You could have handled this privately. We've had 51 years, Elle. After everything we've been through, you do this to me." There it was, the invocation of history as a chain, the old shared tragedies dragged out as human shields. "I handled our loneliness privately for years," I replied, my voice still even. "I handled your distance privately, your jokes, your disregard, your boredom. I even handled your affair privately, for one night. That was enough. Privacy is where your lies grew fat." He flinched at the word affair like it was vulgar, like the content of what he'd been doing was less offensive than my naming it. I could see him searching for angle, narrative, something he could take back inside to salvage his reflection in other people's eyes. "We can fix this," he said quickly, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "You're upset. I understand. Really, I do. I made a mistake. It doesn't mean I don't love you. We can go back in there. We can tell them this was a misunderstanding or one of your episodes." The last word landed with a dull, heavy thud. "My what?" He swallowed, realizing too late he'd said it aloud. "You know how you get, Ellen. After the surgery with the pain medication, sometimes you exaggerate, see things in a certain light. We could say you got something wrong. People will believe it. They know you're sensitive these days." There it was, the second betrayal, swift and instinctive. If he couldn't deny the evidence, he would question my mind. It was almost elegant, the way his survival instinct reached for my erasure. I studied his face, the lines I'd watched deepen over decades, the eyes that had once looked at me like I was the only solid thing in a shifting world. I realized, with a calm that surprised me, that there was nothing left in that face I trusted. "You would rather convince them I'm senile," I said slowly, "than admit you are a liar." He didn't answer, which was answer enough. The sliding door opened softly and closed. Our daughter stood a few feet away, wrapped in the golden spill of light from inside, her cheeks wet, her eyes tracking between us like she was watching a car crash in slow motion. "Mom," she whispered, "what is going on?" For a moment, the urge to soften it for her rose in me like muscle memory. I had always been the translator of his sins, turning his absences into work obligations, his moods into stress. But those days were done. If I loved her, truly loved her, I owed her something better than another curated lie. "What's going on?" I said gently. "Is that your father has been seeing another woman for quite some time. I found everything last night. I gave it to you tonight because I will not carry it alone." She shook her head, but not in disbelief. I saw it in her eyes, the awful flicker of recognition. She remembered too many unexplained trips, too many late meetings that didn't quite match the calendar, Too many weekends where I sat alone while he had plans. Our children were never as blind as we wanted them to be. "Dad?" she asked, her voice breaking. Jack reached for her, but she stepped back an inch, barely visible unless you were looking closely. And I was. "It's not what it looks like," he began, "because cheaters are issued that sentence like a passport. Your mother is overreacting. We've had issues, yes, ups and downs, but it's complicated." He looked at me, silently begging me to help sustain his fiction the way I always had. I let the silence answer for me. Our daughter wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, a gesture oddly reminiscent of when she was a child. "I saw the dates," she said softly. "You were with her when Mom was in the hospital after her fall last year." That detail, buried somewhere in the stack of evidence, had branded itself into her memory in the seconds after she'd opened that envelope. Jack hesitated, stammered, tried to reach for mitigating fluff, but there are some facts too precise to decorate. I watched his mouth move around unfinished sentences, watched the shape of the man my children admired collapse cell by cell. This was the part that hurt, not for him, but for them. He saw it too, panic rising. "We shouldn't do this here," he snapped suddenly, that familiar edge of control in his tone. "People are inside. This is a family matter. Ellen, you've made your point. Let's go in, send everybody home, talk like adults." What he meant was, put this back where no one can see it. I straightened my shoulders. "I am talking like an adult," I said. "For the first time in years, if you want to go inside and lie to them again, you're free to try. I'm done being your stagehand." He stepped closer, lowering his voice further. His words meant just for me. "You think they'll admire you for this?" he hissed. "A bitter old woman spreading private filth around like confetti? They'll pity you. They'll call you vindictive. They'll say you've lost your mind. Everyone looks up to us. You're destroying that." It was almost comical, his devotion to reputation, even as his life's fabric came apart in his hands. For so long I had moved heaven and earth to keep that fabric neat, afraid of gossip, afraid of scandal, afraid of being the couple people whispered about at the grocery store. But in that moment, underneath the quiet sky, I understood that those hypothetical whispers had stolen more from me than any rumor ever could. "If they call me vindictive, let them," I replied. "If they pity me, I won't hear it. I have listened to you for 51 years. Now you can listen to yourself ring in an empty room." Behind him, through the glass, I saw movement. Margaret hovering uncertainly near the door, our friend from church murmuring to her husband, people collecting coats, polite smiles slipping. The party was dissolving, everyone eager to escape before their own illusions were called up next. Jack saw it too, and swore under his breath. "You've ruined everything," he said. The words struck me as absurd in their smallness. Everything, to him, meant a few hours of people praising him over catered food. To me, it meant decades of swallowing disrespect, of shrinking myself so his comfort could grow. "No, Jack," I said softly. "I've ended it. There's a difference." Our daughter took a step toward me then, not to embrace exactly, but to place herself beside me. A quiet alignment. It was enough. He saw it, that slight shift of loyalty, and something ugly flashed across his face. "Fine," he spat. "You two stand out here and feel superior. But remember whose house this is, whose money paid for this. Whose name? He stopped because he knew, and I knew, that line would not hold. The accounts had our names together. The pension he boasted about was built while I raised the children, worked part-time, managed every corner of our life so he could look uninterruptedly successful. The house itself he had partly bought with the inheritance from my mother. People like him forget history until you remind them the receipts exist. He faltered, and I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head. In that gap, another shape emerged from the doorway. Our son, slower, heavier, his brow furrowed. He had arrived late, flight delayed, walked straight into the wreckage. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, eyes moving from the envelopes clutched in people's hands to his father's strained face, to me standing on the lawn like the calmest part of the storm. Before Jack could answer, Margaret, God bless her inability to whisper, said too loudly from behind him, "It seems your father's vows had supplements." That was enough. The room emptied faster after that. People left with awkward embraces, muttered blessings, averted gazes. No one wanted to choose sides publicly, not yet. They liked us better as a symbol than as a complication. That suited me just fine. Symbols are fragile. Women like me survive. Inside, the house grew quieter, the clatter fading until it was just the four of us. The man who'd betrayed me, the daughter who now saw him clearly, the son who stood on the threshold of choosing how much truth he could bear, and me, the supposed fragile one who had just dismantled our curated life with a handful of printed pages and a steady voice. "Mom," my son said slowly, "did he really?" I nodded once. Jack reached for him, desperate. "She's blowing this out of proportion," he insisted. "It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. You know your mother. She dramatizes. Enough," I said, not loudly, but with a finality that stopped all three of them. It was the same tone I'd once used when they were small and playing too close to the road. "I'm not going to argue with you in front of our children about whether your actions counted. They counted to me. That's enough." My son looked between us for a long moment, then said, more to himself than anyone, "I saw some dates, too, on those pages." He didn't move to my side like his sister had, not yet. Men rarely break formation that quickly. But he didn't embrace his father either. He just stood there in the uncomfortable space between knowing and accepting. That was his work, not mine. We drifted inside eventually, drawn by habit more than choice, everyone standing in the dimmed light of the once festive room. The centerpieces sat untouched. A stray fork gleamed near a half-eaten canapé. One candle had burned itself into a puddle of wax, guttering. It looked like the morning after a wake. Jack tried one more time, his voice lower now, softer, trying to sound like the reasonable one. "Ellen, let's think this through. We have built a life. The house, the accounts, the friends. You don't want to throw everything away at your age. Where are you going to go? What will people say? You need me." That last sentence was the funniest thing he'd said in years. I almost thanked him for the gift. "Jack," I said, "I stopped needing you a long time ago." I just didn't admit it because I confused habit with devotion. That's my shame, not yours. As for where I'll go, that's my concern. As for what people will say, they've been saying things about us for 50 years. Let them finally say something true. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. "You'd leave? After all this? Over some texts?" The childishness of it, the way he shrank the enormity of his betrayal down to a digital quirk, made something hot and sharp coil in my chest. Not over some texts, I said. Over the man who wrote them, and the man who stood here tonight and thought he could keep both lives as long as I stayed quiet. I'm done being the quiet part of your story. He stepped back, actually physically stepped back, as if the absence of my compliance had created a drop in the floor only he could feel. That was the moment, I think, that the second wave hit. Not the spectacle at the table, not the whispers of the guests, but this private recognition inside him that I was no longer the fixed star by which he navigated his illusions. It frightened him, so he reached, finally, for the oldest weapon. If you do this, he said slowly, don't expect help. Don't expect support from me, not financially, not with anything. You walk out alone. I looked at him and almost pitied him for not knowing me at all. I've been alone beside you for years, I answered. I already know the terrain. Upstairs, my dress hung in the mirror's edge as I walked past to the closet. I took out a suitcase, the old brown one I'd once packed for our first big trip, and laid it on the bed. Every motion felt deliberate, sacramental. I could hear muffled conversation downstairs, our daughter's low, shaking anger, our son's halting attempts to mediate, Jack's weary, cornered explanations. None of it concerned me anymore. The second wave had come, tried to drag me back with guilt and threats and appeals to appearances, and I had stayed standing. That was the escalation I hadn't anticipated, not his, but mine. The willingness to walk through the wreckage and choose myself, not in a blaze of revenge, but in the quiet, relentless way you choose to finally lock a door that's been blowing in the wind for too long. When I zipped the suitcase closed, the sound was so final it felt like a door sealing in my chest. It wasn't rage that moved through me anymore, that had burned itself out somewhere between the laughter of the guests and the breaking of his voice. What was left was something quieter and steadier, a kind of clean detachment, the way you might look at an old photograph you once loved and now simply recognize. I walked around the bedroom, taking what was mine not by law or sentiment, but by memory. A few clothes, the old pearl earrings my mother left me, the photo of the children when they were still small and the future still seemed like a promise rather than a wait. I left the rest. The jewelry he'd bought to make up for absences, the dresses I'd worn for his colleagues' dinners, the letters from decades ago when he still wrote me words I believed in. They belonged to another woman. I didn't owe her rescue. Downstairs, the house was a low hum of voices, too polite and tired for argument, too afraid for reconciliation. The smell of food and extinguished candles hung in the air like old perfume. Jack was standing by the doorway when I came down, one hand gripping the back of a chair, the other holding a glass he hadn't drunk from. His tie was crooked, his shirt half untucked, the perfect man unraveling by degrees. He saw the suitcase and straightened, his face shifting from disbelief to alarm. "Ellen, what are you doing?" he said, though we both knew. "You can't just leave." I could, and I would. But I had learned that silence carried more power than declarations, so I simply set the suitcase by the door, reached for my coat, and buttoned it slowly. "We can talk in the morning," he tried again. "It's late. Everyone's upset. Let's just sleep on it." The words were familiar, the soft edges of a command disguised as care. It had always worked before because I had wanted peace more than truth. But peace built on pretense had become a kind of poison, and I'd already swallowed enough. "You should go to bed, Jack," I said evenly. "You've had a long night." He stepped closer, lowering his voice, and for the first time in years there was a hint of panic in it. Please don't do this. We can start over. We can take a trip, see a counselor, whatever you want. Don't throw everything away over one mistake. That word again, mistake, like infidelity, was something you tripped over in the dark rather than planned with hotel reservations and coded texts. You didn't make one mistake, I said quietly. You built a second life. I'm just ending it for you. He reached for my arm then, not violently, but in the desperate way a drowning man grabs at anything that floats. I looked down at his hand and said, "Don't." He froze, released me, stepped back. I could see it in his eyes then, the dawning realization that there was no script for this, no apology or performance that could reset the stage. I walked past him into the living room, the suitcase wheels whispering over the rug, and paused at the mantel where the gold-framed anniversary photo stood. In the picture, we were younger, smiling, the children around us, the illusion intact. I picked it up, looked at it one last time, then turned it face down. He watched, speechless. "You're being cruel," he said finally, as if cruelty were new to our marriage. I almost laughed. "Cruelty," I said, "is lying to someone every day and calling it protection." The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock, each second stretching like an echo. I thought of all the nights I had waited for him to come home, of the dinners gone cold, the polite explanations, the way I had turned loneliness into routine so efficiently it had stopped hurting. Tonight, the waiting was over. When I opened the door, the cold air hit me, sharp and bracing. The yard lights glowed weakly, half of them flickering where the wiring had gone bad. He had promised to fix them months ago, another small lie of neglect. I pulled the suitcase over the threshold, feeling the slight bump as it left the tile for the porch wood, and something inside me eased, as if that simple motion marked a border between the woman I had been and the one I was becoming. Behind me, he followed, stopping just at the doorframe, unwilling to cross it. "Where will you go?" he asked, softer now, stripped of accusation. "It's late. You shouldn't be alone." I turned, met his eyes. "I've been alone for a long time, Jack. I just stopped pretending otherwise." For a moment, he looked almost human again, smaller, older, the arrogance drained. "I'm sorry," he said. "I never wanted to hurt you." I believed he meant it in that instant, but apologies offered at the ruins of trust are like flowers planted in frost. They look tender, but nothing takes root. "You already did," I said gently. "But it's all right. I'm done being hurt by it." Then, because I wanted closure, not cruelty, I added, "Take care of yourself." And I stepped out into the night. The road was quiet. The party lights faded behind me, replaced by the steady rhythm of my own footsteps and the low murmur of distant cars. I didn't cry. Tears felt too small for what this was. There's a strange calm that comes when you finally do the unthinkable, the thing you've feared for so long that it becomes an invisible boundary around your life. Crossing it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like air after years underwater. At the end of the street, I turned back once. Through the window, I could see him standing in the doorway, framed by the soft yellow light, a man surrounded by the wreckage of his own invention. I hoped, in a detached way, that he would feel the weight of that emptiness, not as punishment, but as recognition. The worst thing you can do to a liar is make him live in silence. I drove through the sleeping town, the streets glistening faintly from a recent rain, the car smelling of dust and lavender from the sachets I'd kept in the glove compartment. The radio played an old song, one we used to dance to in our 20s, back when love still felt like discovery rather than obligation. I let it play, not as nostalgia, but as a reminder of how long I'd been carrying ghosts. The drive to my sister's cottage by the sea took 2 hours, long enough for the adrenaline to fade into exhaustion. But underneath it all, there was an odd sense of exhilaration. I had done something irreversible, something women of my generation were trained to fear more than death: disobedience. We were raised to endure, to preserve, to stay. To leave was considered not courage, but failure. Yet sitting there, hands steady on the wheel, I felt no failure. I felt alive, sharpened, stripped of pretense. When I reached the coast, dawn was just beginning to stain the sky a pale silver. The cottage stood at the edge of the dunes, small and simple, the same place where I'd spent summers as a girl before life began demanding constant proof of usefulness. I parked, carried the suitcase up the short path, and unlocked the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of salt and wood smoke. Everything was exactly as I'd left it the last time. A few old books, a kettle, the faded quilt on the bed. I set the suitcase down and stood for a moment, listening to the soft rush of waves through the open window. It felt like standing inside a heartbeat. I took off my coat, my shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands, still ringed with the faint tan line where my wedding band had rested for half a century, looked unfamiliar. I slipped the ring off the night before, not in anger but in ceremony, and had left it in the champagne glass beside his untouched drink. I imagined him finding it later, the gold circle glinting at the bottom of the glass, heavy with implication. It was a small act, but precise, like placing the final period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. As the light grew, I walked down to the water's edge. The sea was calm, gray-blue, breathing in slow, steady waves that mirrored my own. I thought of all the women I had known, neighbors, cousins, friends, who had endured in silence, mistaking endurance for virtue, their names gradually dissolving into the background of their husbands' stories. I wondered how many of them had ever stood like this, alone but unafraid, realizing too late that they could have left long before they were erased. For years I had believed that dignity meant staying composed no matter what was done to you. Now I understood that dignity sometimes means walking away without a backward glance. I stayed by the shore until the sun rose fully, turning the water into a trembling sheet of light. In that glow, I felt something uncoil inside me, a tension older than the marriage itself, the inherited obedience of mothers and grandmothers who had kept the peace at all costs. The cost had always been themselves. I whispered to them then, not as prayer, but as promise. It ends here. The waves carried it away, soft and certain. When I went back inside, I made tea, sat at the small table, and wrote a letter. Not to him, but to myself. A record of the moment, so I wouldn't later question whether I had imagined my own courage. You did not destroy anything, I wrote. You simply stopped pretending it was whole. Then I signed my name, Ellen, and folded the page neatly into the drawer. By afternoon, I knew he would have called, first me, then our children, maybe even my sister. There would be messages full of remorse, confusion, fear of scandal. I didn't look at the phone. Some silences are not absence, but boundary. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the small cottage, rearranging it the way I liked, the way no one else would question or undo. Outside, gulls circled. The wind lifted the curtains, and for the first time in decades, the air inside the room belonged entirely to me. That was the climax. Not the exposure, not the leaving, but the stillness that came after, when the noise of justification finally fell away and all that remained was the simple fact of survival. In the weeks that followed, life did something very ordinary and very miraculous. It went on, not with fanfare, not with some sudden late-in-life romance or dramatic reinvention, but with small, stubborn continuities that slowly stitched themselves into a new shape around me. The cottage settled into my bones, the way the old house once had, before it filled with drafts and ghosts. Mornings began with the sound of the sea pushing and pulling at the shore, like an old patient lung, and I found that waking up alone did not feel like abandonment. It felt like an honest arrangement between my body and the day. I made coffee in a chipped blue mug my sister had left, swept sand from the floorboards, opened windows without asking if anyone minded the breeze. My hands, which had spent a lifetime chopping, scrubbing, straightening for other people's comfort, learned a slower choreography. Tending a few pots of rosemary and basil on the stoop, mending only the clothes I actually wore, folding my sweaters into neat, selfish piles. There was money enough in the account with my name on it. There was a small pension that did not vanish without his approval. There was a key that fit only this door, and the knowledge that I had been convinced I owned less of my life than I truly did felt, in hindsight, like the cruelest trick of all. The first letter from Jack arrived after 10 days, forwarded by my sister without commentary. It was thick, front and back, his handwriting tense and uneven, full of apologies and explanations knotted together so tightly they choked each other. He wrote about shame, about how much he'd risked for that other woman, about feeling old and invisible, as if infidelity were a symptom of male fragility, and I were expected, once again, to tend the wound. He told me the children were angry with him, that the neighbors were talking, that church felt different, and under all of it pulsed the same desperate thesis: come back and help me be the man they think I am. I folded the pages carefully and slid them back into the envelope without finishing the last paragraph, not out of spite, but because I recognized the pattern too well. It was still about him, his fear, his image, his grief at losing the version of me that made his life legible. My absence, he wrote, was punishment. He still hadn't understood it was release. I placed the envelope in the drawer with my letter to myself, a small archive of what I had survived, and I did not respond. The second letter came with fewer words and more legal hints about property and division and what people might assume if I refused to engage. I sent that one directly to a modest lawyer in town, whose office smelled of old paper and rain, and with his help I signed my name where it finally mattered, untangling what could be untangled. It was done without drama in a room with humming fluorescent lights, and when the papers were filed, I walked out into the weak coastal sun, feeling lighter, not jubilant, not triumphant, just rightly aligned, as if the furniture of my life had been pushed back to where it should have been all along. My daughter called one evening at dusk, the sky bruised mauve over the water, her voice smaller than I remembered, shorn of the easy certainties she'd grown up inside. She didn't ask me to go back. That was the first thing that told me she had grown. She asked if I was safe, if I had enough, if I needed her to come. I told her the truth, that I was lonely in a way that did not scare me, that I had food and a roof and my own name, that she did not need to fix what I had chosen. There was a long pause. Then she said, "I'm so angry at him I can't see straight. But half of that anger is for never seeing you were this unhappy." I told her I hadn't let her see it, that mothers of my making had been taught to stand between their children and disappointment like human shields. "Don't do that," I said gently. "When your life hurts, let your girls know where. Don't teach them to disappear." We cried a little, not in that frantic way people do when begging, but in the slower rhythm of two women finally speaking as equals. We agreed she would visit when things settled, only her and the children, no performances at the doorstep. When I hung up, the cottage felt less like an exile and more like a harbor. My son took longer. Sons often do. His first call was clumsy, full of phrases about both sides and everyone makes mistakes, the debris of a world that excuses men for never growing up. I let him falter through it and then said, "I love you, but I won't participate in softening this for you. What your father did was a choice. What I did was another. You decide what kind of man you want to be based on that." He was quiet for a long time, then said only, "Are you sure you're okay?" I said, "Yes." This time it wasn't a reflex. Little by little, his messages shifted from defending his father to asking about my day, the book I was reading, the color of the sky. That, too, was a kind of healing. Once, about a month in, there was an envelope without a return name, just familiar city ink. Inside, a short note from the woman he'd broken himself for. 2 lines about not wanting trouble, about not realizing the depth of your history, about her intention to step back. I stared at those careful phrases and felt no triumph, only a tired recognition of how often women are pitted along the wrong fault line. She had been a symptom, not the disease. I burned the note in a chipped ashtray and opened all the windows, not as ritual, simply to let the room smell like the sea again. By late summer, a small garden had taken hold behind the cottage, absurd in its stubbornness on that thin strip of sandy soil. I planted tomatoes too close together, basil that bolted, a row of marigolds just because my mother once told me they keep the bad spirits out of the beans, and I liked the idea that something bright and ordinary could still be considered protection. I walked to the market on Tuesdays, exchanged recipes with a widow who lived 3 houses down, poured coffee for myself in the mornings without the pretense of pouring for 2. Loneliness visited, of course it did, settling beside me some evenings like an old acquaintance with nothing new to say, but it no longer dictated the terms of my life. When it whispered that I had thrown away too much, I could answer it plainly. What I threw away was the story that I did not exist outside his needs. Everything else I carried with me. I heard, through the patient grapevine that always finds its way to women, that Jack now went to church alone, that the congregation shifted around him with the stiff politeness people reserve for fallen statues, that he'd tried a few times to paint the ending differently, blaming stress, my overreaction, the cruelty of age. But the evidence I'd laid down in front of witnesses had its own stubborn life. You can't unknow plainly written facts. I did not relish his discomfort, though a younger wound in me would have. I simply accepted it as the weather he had called down on himself. My justice was not in watching him sink, but in knowing he no longer held the power to drag me under. Some nights, when the house is quiet and the tide is high, I sit by the window with a blanket around my shoulders, a book open and forgotten on my lap, and I think about the girl I was when I said yes to him, the woman I became while keeping that yes polished, and the woman I am now without him. I don't hate the earlier versions of myself. I understand her compromises, her terror of being alone, her pride in endurance. She did the best she could with the rules she'd been given. But I am grateful, fiercely, that I did not let her be the last word. If this story ever wanders into the hands of a woman sitting in her too quiet kitchen, staring at a glowing screen that has just told her the truth her life was built against, I want her to hear me clearly through whatever years lie between us. You are not crazy. You are not petty. You are not selfish for refusing to be the stage on which someone else rehearses their better self while spending their real tenderness elsewhere. Do not wait for the apology that explains everything or for the audience to clap for your dignity. Sometimes the bravest thing you will ever do is pick up your keys, your name, your tired, loyal heart, and walk toward a smaller, truer life that belongs only to you. The world will call it leaving. You will know it for what it is, arriving.